All right, so my name is Christoffer Niska. I'm the CTO at Nord Software. We develop web apps for various sized clients. We have around 30 developers. We're based in Etutöölö here in Helsinki. Today I'm gonna tell you a little bit about the things I've learned, or we learned, while building 10 React applications within a year or a little bit more. That's counting the React Native apps we've done, but still. So hopefully I won't tell too much stuff that you already know, but we'll see. All right, let's see. There we go. So just really short about the build process. So we use npm scripts. We skipped grunt and gulp. We left them behind. We use npm scripts because it's very convenient that you can configure whatever you're running there, and you can have a single entry point for running the app, npm start. So that's convenient for the developers to. If it's always the same command, it's very easy to jump in, npm test for tests and so forth. So we use Webpack. That's kind of a no-brainer in a sense. Webpack is great, but when you want to scale your app to development and production and various other builds, it's a little bit of a hassle. So what we did was we split up the config into a base config, then we have a production config, and then we have a development config and whatever other configs you need. And then we merge them using merge deep. It's a library. You can also use the Webpack merge, but we haven't used that. So then you can actually have like something like npm run build that runs your production build, and npm start just runs your development build, the Webpack dev server. You probably all know, but the dev server is awesome because you can have the hot module replacement enabled, and it makes development far more fun than it used to be with live reload. Then we use Babel to transpile our code from ES6. We use quite a lot of ES6 features, and it makes for much cleaner code. And this is the primary reason why I love React over Angular 1, which I used to work with for something like 3 years or something like that. So then we lint all our codes, including tests, using ESLint, and it's a very good idea to involve the linting at an early stage. You probably all know, because you don't want to have your DevOps when he's deploying telling you that, hey, there's like 500 linting errors. I helped a client a week ago to fix 13,000 linting errors after we added a lint to a it was a 3-week-old project. So that didn't take more than an hour, but still a lot of find and replace. A little bit about testing. So with React, I've done quite a lot of. I've written quite a lot of tests, and for the test runner, I chose Mocha. I looked into using Jest, but I quickly turned away from Jest because it just wasn't working for me, and I've heard the same comment from a lot of other developers who also tried it. Mocha is a test runner for those who doesn't know. And with Mocha, it's very convenient to use Chai, which is a assertion library that lets you do like expect something. I have some tests later and some code, so it won't be like this for the whole presentation. Let's go forward. So we use Enzyme from Airbnb. You can connect it with Chai, so you can do assertions on properties and state and other things. There's a lot of things that Airbnb implemented, so it makes testing components far easier than. It's basically just syntax sugar, but it also gives you some neat functions like mount, shallow, and render, which lets you kind of mount your components in a isolated space, and it gives you a wrapper where you can on which you can do asserts. So it's quite convenient in that sense. And then we use Sign-on to do spies for click handlers, so you can test that your component did mount was called if you so please, or if you have a on click or something like that, you can test that it actually does trigger the callback when it should. All right. So a little bit of code. So we use maybe 95% of our components, if not more, are stateless. So our approach is basically that we connect the root component to the state, and then we just use presentational stateless components to render everything, and they get their data through props. So it makes it really easy to test the components, and also it kind of makes for neat small micro components like this. This is a very simplified version of a button component, but it should give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So this, if you haven't used stateless components, don't use classes everywhere. It's really heavy, and I've seen that in practice. So I'm speaking out of experience here. All right, and then the next thing I'm gonna talk about is high order components. So this is something that is very convenient. It's kind of an advanced topic, but I thought I'd still mention it because maybe not of all, maybe all of you haven't heard about it. So first about providers. So if you used Redux, you probably know the provider, the state provider. So there's a little bit of code here, and it's more to prove the point or give a better idea of how it works. So it's just an example code. So we have a theme provider, which defines a few prop types. It defines a theme name and its children, and then it puts that theme in the child context type, so we can inject that in any child component down the render tree. So so here we define that whenever you use context, it's gonna get an object that has a name, which is mapped to the theme name property, and then it simply renders its children, so it doesn't render like an empty div or anything. It just uses children only to render. And here's just an example of an index file down here where we have the theme provider imported, and then we put that at the root level of our render tree. Very basic React. Let's go back. There we go. All right, and then decorators. So the providers and decorators go like together very neatly. So you can do something like this, continuing on the theme aspect. We define here a decorator, which is a function that takes a component and returns a new component that wraps your original component, and it adds the prop here, theme.name as theme name. So then in your button you can just use this, and it's magically getting injected in there. So you could use this for something like the logged in user, or checking permissions, or internationalization. Actually, like Yahoo's Intel library uses something similar to this. This is a very simplified version, but it should give you a good idea of how everything works. All right, so next I'm gonna talk about immutable application state. So the root of it all is Immutable.js by Facebook, and it lets, for those who doesn't know what it is, it's a library that gives you immutable objects with a lot of convenient functions, similar to what Lodash does as in functions. So you can have like a list or a map or something, and it's immutable, so you have to, every time you update it or you kind of change it, it gives you a new reference. It doesn't change the original object at all. Together with that, we use Redux, and that's a kind of I think that's what everyone is probably using who's doing React nowadays. How many of you use Redux? Not that many. How many uses React? Is it like, you know, there's a lot of Angular 2 people around here, I guess. All right, so let's go forward. So first, when I started working with Redux, the problem was that there was no really clear definition for the actions. So you could just randomly, it's basically our object literal that has a type, and then it can have any number of other properties. So something called Flux standard action gives you kind of a neat framework to work with. It standardizes the action structure. So a Flux standard action always has a payload which has the data in it, and then if there's an error, it has an error that is true, and so forth. Worth checking out if you're not using it and you're doing Redux. Let's see. All right. Redux Promise is a library from the same guy who proposed the Flux standard action. And what it does is it gives you a Redux middleware which lets you have all your actions as promises. You'll see in the example later maybe how it works. But this is similar to what you can read if you go to the Redux documentation. There's an example how to reduce boilerplate, and there's an example like how you can do an API middleware. This is kind of like a promise solution to that. All right, and let's see, yeah, there. And from the same guy, there's another library called Redux Actions, which lets you compose actions in a very convenient way. I have an example in a bit. Probably, all right. And then there's one final library from another guy who he has built, for example, the Redux form, which is a pretty commonly used component. He proposed a thing called Redux modules, which means that you bundle your action creators and your reducer in the same file. I have an example here next, I think. So first, there's a test. This is a pretty simple test. We have a to-do state, and it adds to-dos. The reason why I use from.js here instead of list is just to have them look the same. Then we just, apparently I forgot an import. But let's assume that this module is the Redux module. The import is missing there. Shouldn't matter. And then it calls a function and gives it the state where the payload is the to-do. And then it just checks that this new state that we got from the handler actually includes that item. And the remove does the same, but it does there's another copy paste there. Sorry, I'll fix that and I'll share the presentation deck on Twitter, for example, so you can find it there. But anyway, this should be removed, so we give it a payload, which is the ID, and then it checks that the state should now be empty. So if someone is wondering about this syntax here, we usually use chai immutable, which lets you work on immutables in a more convenient way. It gives you like to have size 3 or something like that. You can use that. That's very convenient. So onto the module, there's apparently, well, that's just the export default reducer, so it should be fine. So the nice thing about the Redux module is that you can actually define these constants for your actions in this file, and you don't need to export them anywhere. You don't need to expose them even from this module, because the action creators are right here. And every action that we create here returns a promise, and if there's no kind of callback, you can add a callback here. If you do like a HTTP call or something like that, and you return the promise from fetch, that works as well. So then it will wait until that has been resolved and before it goes here to the handle actions. Both the create action and handle actions is from the Redux actions library, and this gives you a convenient way of defining your reducer. So you probably all seen the switch case. I had like a switch case where you had like 30 until I had to do something about it. It wasn't working anymore. So this is just basically key value. So the key is of course your name, which will be this, and then the value is a function that takes the state and an action as its argument, and it returns the new state. So simply handle add does a push to the state, and it does a from JS to turn this into a map, and it takes the action payload, which was the to-do with the ID and the text. And similarly, the handle remove does the same. It works in the same state, but it does a filter where the ID is not the payload. So you get that specific to do you wanted to remove, that gets removed. And then you can give it a default state here. So you give it here like you give to a reducer normally. So I think this is a very convenient way of kind of bundling your state logic together and makes it highly testable and very, very convenient. All right. That is apparently all right. And then there is React Redux, which is basically a connection library between React and Redux. It gives you a decorator and some other tools to make it easy to work with, and it gives you a provider that provides the state to the components and so forth. So I have an example here of my final create store, which is used on the next slide. So here it simply uses the functions from Redux to create the store. It combines all the reducers, which I import here. So every single module you would have, you would import separately and just add it to the list. And then it takes an initial state, which is this is actually that's interesting. There's a small error there, but that don't matter. Don't mind that. This should always be empty in this case, but in some cases you might want to set the initial state, and then it applies the promise middleware here. So that lets you have the action creators to return promises. So in short, all the action creators in this app and other apps return promises. So it's kind of unified in that way. But Redux doesn't really care about what you return. So then we have the index file that goes with that. So basically we just create the store, we give it to the state provider, which we get from React Redux, and then the rest is the same as we had before. So there is not that much that is going on here. And then we have apparently this is also the default export. So I had to use a different syntax here because the syntax highlighter wouldn't work with all of this. This is the to-dos components. I put them in the same file just to make it easier to see. Usually I structure them so that I have a folder which is called, in this case, for example, to-dos, and then you have an item class or file that contains just this, and a list that contains that, and then a to-dos that contain the lower one there. So the thing here is that here we use a connect AS6 decorator to connect these to-dos to the state. We map the state's to-dos to the data, and that comes here, and then the data is just passed down to the list, which does a map and renders a to-do for each single one, and it also passes the onRemove callback to the to-do item, so that you can click the X here, and it will actually invoke the remove from the Redux module. So this way all of these components are stateless, so you don't need any component lifecycle or anything. You can just test this without connecting it and just use props. So it's very easy to test the components. Then I think we have, was that the last one? Probably. Yep. All right. So then about prop types and default props. So this is something that many people, I know at least, overlooks a lot and really doesn't use. Prop types is in short a type to validate your properties, and default props are the default values. If you don't give it a value, then it will take that value. So to continue on the previous example, we could do something like define the prop types for the to-do item where you have data, which is a shape that has an ID, which is a number and is required, and then we have a text, which is a string obviously, and that's also required, and the shape itself is required. And the onRemove is a function that is required. So now if someone passes something else than this, it will obviously not work, and it will give you a warning in the console, so it makes for really easy to test code. Same for the to-do list. There's a data that is an instance of a list, and onRemove is a function that gets passed down. And then another thing people overlook very often is the default props, because if you set the default props for the data for the list, you don't need to give it in your test, so it will be automatically, you can run it without giving it an empty list, because it will be automatically set to a list. I think that's pretty convenient. All right, really shortly about routing. So obviously we use the React router, which is kind of the de facto router for React. So here's an example of my routes file. So what we do is we separate the routes into a separate file, because in large apps this file can get really huge. So what we noticed after doing quite large apps that has a lot of routes, so when you want to change a route, it's really tedious to go with find and replace every single place where you use that route. So that's why we use a routes map, and we have this get route function. So every time you do a link, or you want to push a new location, you use this get route and you give it like a name, like the to-dos, for example, and it will give you the right route. So if you want to change the route later, then it's pretty easy. In production, you should do a redirect. That's what the React router says, but during development, I don't think that's a good idea. And then it's just used here, and the component is mounted like this. So this is the connected component. And one thing we recently noticed was that it's a very good idea to only connect your components that are used directly by the routes. So there is actually, here's the, I'll get back to that in a sec. So here's the index file. We just give it the routes. This is very convenient. I like to have a small index file, not like a huge 300 lines file where it has like 50 routes nested inside each other and no one can actually find out what's happening. All right, so then really shortly about named components. This is a really good feature that is probably also a little bit overlooked. So it's about, if you use Angular's UI router, this is very much the same. So you can define different regions, let's say main and sidebar, and then you can mount the components in those regions. So you would actually you could now, if you have this here, you could have a component up here, which could be like app, and it would use props.main to render this part, and props.sidebar to render this part. So this way you could do the same for the footer and the navbar and whatever you want to. So it's very convenient if you have a really nested layout, like if you have if you have tabs or anything like that. So you could basically do so that you can also nest this, so you could have a component, let's say the account page, which is very different from the products page, and you could have a component there that uses named components that are nested under, so you could basically just switch out different regions very conveniently by the route. I've seen many attempts to do this in the app logic, and that's not a very good idea. You can like active tab is this, that doesn't really work, and it doesn't scale. All right, and then just really shortly, if you want to connect the router to the state, you can use the Redux React router, which gives you a reducer and some actions that you can use, like push, replace, whatever you need to do with the router. So it gives you like a convenient way of interacting with the router. So this is a really this is something that I really think about when making code. So I try to make components that do a single thing. So try to kind of think about what should this component do, and if you need a component that does two things, you probably need two components. That's from what I've learned from experience, that it's far easier to it makes for far easier code reuse, and you can easily see parallels that this is kind of similar with that if you don't do like huge components. I've seen like components that are 3,000 lines of code, which are not very pleasant. So split up the components into small presentational parts. Yeah, that's it. I hope I had something that you didn't know if you had been working with React. Is there any questions? Anyone? All right.
That slide just before getting across, there was a point that you found null.
Oh yeah, so it's a callback. It's basically a dispatch action. So we don't need the scope there, but we need to pass it. Let's go see if we can go back. Maybe not. I'll just do it from here. Let's see. So we have
There.
here. Yeah. So this on remove doesn't need a scope, but it needs to. You need to pass a value. Otherwise, you invoke this function here, and you can't really do that. So if you want to pass the ID from, that should actually be data.id. Yeah, this should be data.id. But anyway, so I usually don't bind to this unless it's necessary. You don't need this scope. Actually, you don't even have you have the function scope, but you don't need that for anything. So I just bind it to null in order to pass the property there.
Why don't you use just a
Here, catch.
function there, and then inside the function called on remove?
Yeah, you could do that. That's shorter.
I don't know, if you use the arrow functions, it probably
Yeah, you could do that.
actually not be shorter.
Yeah, you could do like empty parenthesis arrow and
Inside that column usually.
yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I haven't thought about that, even though I've written quite a few callbacks.
And now you can change it.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions, ideas, or? Yep.
Hang on. Take the catch box. Here.
Ah.
Oh, okay. Yes. Have you tried using some? Oh. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
Didn't know it's a microphone. Okay. Have you tried using Saga or some other middleware for this like asynchronous actions?
So, if you could be a little bit more specific about what you're
Yes.
what you want to achieve.
Yes, so let's say we want to use Redux and we have complex asynchronous actions that can have, let's say, like 5 different asynchronous actions,
Yep.
and this is like a single sequence.
All
so
right.
what is your experience with such?
So originally what I learned on the like early on was that you could just do like, you could do map dispatch to state, dispatch to props, and just invoke many dispatches here, but that's a bad idea. The better idea is to create a composed action creator that, like, let's say you want to fetch the analytics for a analytics dashboard. You don't want to fetch 7 different types of analytics. You would just want to say that fetch analytics, and that could do a promise all. And as you use the promise middleware, it will work seamlessly with whatever you're kind of doing. So you can kind of compose the actions. So I would abstract it away from this and try to aim for as simple action creators so that you can use bind action creators. This is just, if you don't know, this is just aliasing this, so add to do's becomes on add and so forth. But yeah, from my experience, the map dispatch to props can grow really large, like hundreds of lines, if you're not careful. Yeah. But definitely, like, composing the action is the best way.
Thanks.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Thanks. I hope you learned something.